we're going to illustrate the situation of the typical firm in a monopolistically competitive industry with this diagram. And the good news is that this diagram is a familiar one. It's the one that we've really been using in thinking about the profit maximizing price that a firm would set. This particular illustration is applicable to a monopolistically competitive firm because in this kind of industry, each firm has some market power. It's got the ability to set the price for its product because it's differentiated its product. It's selling something that's a substitute for the products of other firms in the industry, but the characteristics of this firm's product are different from those of other firms. So that's sort of the monopolistic part of the market structure, selling a unique product. The competitive part comes from the fact that there are quite a few firms, in fact many firms, in the industry. So there's possibly many close substitutes for the product that our firm is selling. So the term competitive comes from the idea that because there are a lot of firms, there's no real possibility of cooperation between them. As we'll see later in the course, if we look at market structures where there are just a few firms in the industry, that's going to open up the possibility that there might be some cooperation between the firms. So, in this familiar situation, the firm is going to set this profit maximizing price because it wants to sell a quantity where it's going to be maximizing profits. So it wants to be selling a quantity where the extra revenue that it gets by selling that last unit of its product is just equal to its marginal cost. And the demand information will tell it what price it's going to set, and we can see that that price in this situation that I've illustrated is above the firm's average total costs. That means that it's making a profit of this difference between the price and average cost, and if we multiply that by the number of units that it sells, we can see what its total profits are in this period of time. As I mentioned earlier, this market structure is assuming that information is pretty good. So if all firms in the industry are experiencing some economic profits, firms that might potentially enter the industry know about that. They know about the existence of these profits, and they might conclude that some profitable opportunity would exist for them if they come into this market. What we'd like to do now is to figure out the consequences for a firm like this if new competitors enter the market. Let's see how we can illustrate that in this diagram. If new firms come into this market, of course, what's going to happen is that demand in the market is going to be shared by a greater number of firms. So if we look at the situation from the point of view of this one firm that we're looking at, its demand is going to be reduced. And it's going to be reduced really for two reasons. One is that, of course, there are more firms in the market, so there's more substitutes, but some of those substitutes could also be closer substitutes than existed before. So demand is not only going to be reduced, it's going to become more elastic, more price elastic. So I would illustrate demand like this by a flatter demand curve that is lying to the left of the demand curve that existed before. And of course, with each demand curve, we have an associated marginal revenue curve. I have, by the way, a technical note posted in D2L just telling you what the relationship is between the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve. The fact is that the marginal revenue curve declines at twice the rate of the demand curve. So I've tried to draw these things so that the marginal revenue curve intersects this horizontal axis halfway between the spot where the demand curve would intersect the axis. So that's just illustrating the idea that marginal revenue declines at twice the rate. In other words, this angle here is twice what this angle is. Well, that's a technical detail we don't really have to worry about, but some of the diagrams in the text really have not been properly drawn. Well, if demand declines like this, that's not going to be good for the firm. Its sales are going to decline and its profits are going to go down. How far will profits fall? The logic is pretty straightforward. As long as profits exist, there's going to be an incentive for new firms to enter the industry. That's going to mean that the typical firm's demand is going to shrink until profits have disappeared. When do profits disappear? Well, profits go to zero when the firm's price is just equal to its average total costs. And remember, of course, those costs are comprehensive costs. They include explicit costs and implicit costs. Economic costs, in other words. So, demand is going to decline as new firms enter the industry until the typical firm is earning zero profits. That's going to mean that the demand curve is just touching the average total cost curve, so that only at this level of output can the firm charge a price that's going to just cover its costs. You can see just by looking at the picture that if the firm charged any other price and produced any other amount of output, its price would lie below average total costs. In other words, it would make a loss. So this is the only level of output and prices where the firm can cover its costs. That, of course, is a profit maximizing situation. Any other situation would result in losses. This situation, I might add, is not necessarily going to last forever. If demand in the market increased, for whatever reasons, then positive profits could re-emerge. And if that happened, it might take some time for new firms to recognize the existence of profits and to enter the industry. After all, it would have to be the case that any increase in demand would have to be perceived by potential new entrants as a permanent increase, not just a temporary one. Otherwise, it might not make sense to enter the industry. I might add that profits could also emerge in this situation if costs went down. Just as an exercise, you might try drawing this picture on a piece of paper and then drawing a picture that would illustrate what would happen if we had a reduction in costs. You should find that profits would then become positive. Well, the next topic that we're going to consider is what would happen if there are barriers to entry, if it's not so easy for firms to enter the industry. So we'd want to think about just what those barriers to entry might be. That will be the topic of the next slide.